3:04 a.m. The excavator was already moving. Floodlights cut across the mud while the side of Dale Turner's farmhouse started coming apart in the dark. Wood cracked. Dust rolled through the cold air. Diesel engines echoed across the property, while the demolition crew kept working like this was just another overnight job. At the edge of the site, the project manager stood with his arms crossed, watching the structure collapse piece by piece. Calm, unhurried, like everything was going exactly according to schedule. Nobody was stopping the demolition. Nobody was even slowing it down. Under state law, First Texas Development Bank could not legally touch Dale's property until 6 a.m. It was 3:04. The crew had already been working for 19 minutes. The bank didn't know that was a problem. Dale did. He was standing 30 feet away in the mud, recording everything on a phone he bought at Walmart 2 years earlier. And before the sun came up, that recording was going to turn into the most expensive mistake the bank had made in a very long time. To understand why Dale was standing there recording instead of panicking, you have to understand one thing: the bank never checked. First Texas Development Bank had gone through a legitimate foreclosure process. Dale had fallen behind on payments after a medical year he rarely talked about. The bank filed the paperwork correctly. The court approved the foreclosure. The demolition permit was valid. The contractor they hired was licensed and experienced. On paper, everything looked routine. Almost everything. What nobody at the bank stopped to verify was the exact time Dale's redemption period expired. Not the date, the time. Under state law, Dale legally had until 6 a.m. on the final day of the redemption period to reclaim the property. That deadline wasn't hidden in complicated legal language. It was clearly written in the statute. The demolition work order listed the correct date. But nowhere on the order did it mention a time. Dale Turner was 67 years old. He had worked that land since he was 19. He wasn't a lawyer, and he wasn't the kind of man who trusted paperwork just because someone in a suit handed it to him. So when he realized the foreclosure was probably going through, he called an attorney and asked one specific question. What time does my redemption period actually expire? The attorney checked the statute and gave him the answer. 6 a.m. Dale wrote it down on a yellow notepad and kept it beside the kitchen phone. 2 days before the demolition, he called the attorney one more time. He asked him what to do if the crew showed up early. The attorney told him to record everything. Then he told him to call immediately if they arrived before 6 o'clock. He also told Dale he would leave his phone on through the night. Dale thanked him, hung up, and set 3 alarms for 2:45 in the morning. Truth was, he probably wasn't going to sleep much anyway. 3:04 a.m. The demolition crew arrived without warning. 14 workers. A cat excavator hauled in on a flatbed. 2 floodlight trailers. A black bank vehicle carrying the project manager, a man named Holt, who had overseen more than 40 demolitions in the last 11 years and considered this one straightforward. Rural property. Single structure. Valid permit. The kind of job that was usually finished before sunrise. He had done this work long enough that most sites started blending together after a while. He assumed this one would too. The farmhouse was dark when the convoy rolled onto the property. Holt took that as a good sign. Sometimes homeowners left before demolition crews arrived. Sometimes they stayed and argued. Either way, the paperwork was finalized and the schedule was already moving. There was no reason to wait. Holt gave the signal. The excavator rolled forward through the mud and lowered its bucket toward the eastern wall. At 3:04 a.m., the first section of the farmhouse came apart. 30 seconds later, Dale's porch light turned on. He stepped outside without a coat, already recording on his phone. No yelling, no panic. He walked to the edge of the property where he could see the entire site clearly, and stopped there in the mud, holding the phone steady with both hands. Holt noticed him immediately. He gave Dale the same quick glance he had given dozens of homeowners before. A man losing property, emotional, angry, probably hoping a recording would slow things down. But Dale wasn't shouting at anyone. He wasn't even moving. He was just standing there, recording in silence, while the excavator kept working behind him. And what Holt never realized was that Dale wasn't only filming the demolition. He was filming the time. 3:06 a.m. Dale made sure the timestamp stayed visible on the screen every chance he got. Not because he cared about documenting the damage, because he cared about documenting when the damage happened. By 3:09, the eastern wall had collapsed into the mud. Holt checked the crew's progress and told the operators they were ahead of schedule. He was right, but he was also standing on property the bank would not legally control for another 2 hours and 51 minutes. Holt didn't know that yet. Dale did. 3:11 a.m. Dale walked toward the entrance of the demolition site, not angry, not rushed, just steady, like a man who already knew exactly what he needed to say. Holt met him near the gate before he got too close to the equipment. Routine job site instinct, easier to handle problems at the perimeter. Dale held the phone at chest level, still recording. Then he looked at Holt and said, "The redemption period on this property doesn't expire until 6 a.m. He glanced once toward the excavator behind him. "You're early." Holt listened, then calmly explained that the demolition permit had already been approved by the county. The foreclosure was complete. The legal process was finished. He spoke patiently, like a man explaining something he believed had already been settled. Dale didn't argue. He nodded once, walked back toward the fence line, and kept recording. 3:14 a.m. That conversation changed everything. Before 3:14, the bank could have argued the timing mistake was accidental, a simple administrative oversight. After 3:14, that defense became much harder to make. Because now, they had been warned, on camera. The legal owner of the property had informed the demolition crew that the redemption deadline had not expired, and the demolition continued anyway. In civil liability law, there is a word for that: willful. The excavator kept moving. Wood splintered into the mud, while floodlights shook through the dust in the air. Holt checked the crew's progress again. They were ahead of schedule. Another 40 minutes, and most of the structure would be gone. The conversation at the gate barely stayed in his mind. To him, it had felt routine. Another homeowner refusing to accept the process was over. What he didn't realize was that Dale's phone had captured the entire exchange clearly, along with the timestamp. Later, attorneys would review that recording frame by frame. But Holt wasn't thinking about any of that yet. He was thinking about the western wall. He gave the signal. The excavator turned toward the rest of the house. 3:22 a.m. Dale made a phone call. Holt noticed from across the site. An older man standing alone in the mud with a phone pressed to his ear, while the excavator kept tearing through the farmhouse behind him. He had seen that before. Usually it was a family member, sometimes an attorney, sometimes just somebody trying to delay the inevitable. Holt walked over and told Dale, calmly that calling someone at 3 in the morning was not going to stop the demolition. The foreclosure was complete. The permit was valid. The process was over. Dale listened, nodded once, then went back to recording. What Holt didn't know was that the attorney answered on the first ring. He had been awake, waiting for the call. 2 days earlier, Dale warned him the crew might arrive before sunrise. The attorney told him to call immediately if that happened. The emergency motion had already been drafted before the demolition even started. Filing it took 4 minutes. At 3:26 a.m., the county court received the motion with an automatic timestamp. At 3:31, the duty judge received the overnight notification. The excavator was already on its 19th pass through the structure. Holt was telling the crew they were making excellent time. There is a certain kind of confidence that comes from experience. Holt had overseen more than 40 demolitions. He knew what panic looked like. A homeowner making late-night phone calls didn't concern him. Most of the time, those calls changed nothing. He wasn't wrong about that in general. He was wrong about Dale specifically, because Dale wasn't making calls out of panic. He was following a plan. 3:45 a.m. The western wall came down. Holt looked over the site with the satisfaction of a job running smoothly. The crew was ahead of schedule. Most of the structure was already gone. He checked the time. 3:47 a.m. To Holt, that felt efficient. What he didn't know was that a county judge was already reviewing an emergency motion describing the demolition as legally premature by nearly 3 hours. Holt looked at the crew and gave a simple instruction. Good work. Keep moving. And they did. 4:20 a.m. The duty judge signed the order. The redemption deadline was clear. The demolition had started nearly 3 hours early. At 4:23, the signed order was transmitted to the county sheriff's department. At that same moment, Holt was standing beside the debris field, watching the crew clear what remained of the foundation. The farmhouse was almost gone. 4:38 a.m. A deputy named Harris received the order while driving a rural highway 12 miles away. He checked the address. Then he accelerated. Between 4:23 and 4:51, the demolition crew finished most of the structure. Holt called the regional office and left a voicemail. Job complete. Ahead of schedule. Crew packing up by sunrise. He left the message at 4:49 a.m. 2 minutes later, Deputy Harris turned onto the access road. 4:51 a.m. Holt saw the headlights through the trees and barely reacted. Law enforcement visited active demolition sites all the time. The deputy parked, stepped out, and walked directly toward him, holding a printed court order. Something about the walk felt wrong immediately. Harris introduced himself and handed Holt the paperwork. Holt read the first page quickly, then slower again. He looked down at his own work order. Date. No time. Then back at the court order. Redemption deadline, 6 a.m. He checked his watch, 4:53, and for the first time that entire night, Holt stopped looking confident. He called the contractor's legal line. He got voicemail. The deputy walked past him toward the excavator operator. No yelling, no scene. The operator looked at the paperwork, reached for the key, and shut the machine down. The engine went quiet at 4:53 a.m. The excavator arm stayed suspended over the debris field, while the floodlights continued burning across the mud. Dale finally lowered his phone. He had been recording for almost 2 hours, and standing there in the cold beside what remained of his farmhouse, Holt finally understood what Dale had known since 3:04 a.m. The floodlights stayed on. Nobody bothered turning them off. Workers sat quietly on equipment they could no longer use while the remaining engines idled in the cold morning air. The site had gone from active demolition to complete silence in less than a minute. Holt still stood near the debris field, holding both pieces of paper, the court order in one hand, his work order in the other. For a long time, he didn't move. Deputy Harris finished his report from inside the cruiser and left the property just after 5:15 a.m. The crew started packing up not long after that. Holt left quietly around sunrise. He never said another word to Dale. Dale stayed. He stood there while the floodlights reflected across the mud and the last trucks pulled off the property one by one. Then he walked back to the porch and sat down facing what remained of the farmhouse. The sun came up slowly over the debris field. The following week, Dale exercised his redemption rights and reclaimed the property. The farmhouse took almost a year to rebuild. He did most of the work himself. The bank spent the next 14 months dealing with lawsuits, insurance claims, and internal reviews over a demolition order that had started 2 hours and 56 minutes too early. They eventually updated their demolition templates. They now include a time. Holt no longer works in demolition, and the recording Dale captured that night is still saved on the same phone he bought at Walmart in 2022. He never deleted it. He says he doesn't need a backup. He knows exactly where it is. If this story stayed with you, share it with somebody who'd understand why it matters. Another story soon. You already know where to find it.